The American Civil War is typically simplified into a narrative of good versus evil, of moral and noble Northerners overcoming an immoral and decadent South in order to end the aberrant practice of slavery. Reality tends to be much messier and less clear morally. What follows is the geographic determinism of the American Civil War. The newly born United States was born in an age of radical economic change. The beginnings of what would become known as the Industrial Revolution were already in swing, and machine power was gradually replacing manual labor in more and more industries. Obtaining affordable mechanical power was at the top of the list of needs for any industrialized business. Steam-based coal power was still in its infancy. The earliest steam engines were huge immobile devices that used vast quantities of coal to pump water out of mine shafts. James Watt didn't invent the piston steam engine until 1765, and he couldn't find a financial backer for it until 1776, the same year America declared independence. Early mechanization efforts relied primarily upon hydropower to move machines. Fast-flowing streams allowed designers to harvest a relatively reliable form of power by forcing the rushing waters to push water wheels, which then powered a variety of machinery. This form of mechanization began to rapidly increase throughout the Middle Ages, and sophisticated systems of partial ownership of shares of watermills and windmills that wove cloth, ground grain, hammered iron, among other uses became more common throughout Europe. It was even more common for legal disputes to break out between watermill owners because damming a river upstream could drastically reduce the flow of water further downstream, resulting in a loss of power. The bottom line is, for the period of the earlier Industrial Revolution, the most reliable and cheapest form of power available to commercial enterprise was hydropower. As the efficiency and complexity of machines grew, so did the need for the fast-flowing rivers that provided the power they needed to run. The most common industry to use this form of power was the textile industry, or the cloth mill. During this period of time, the Northeast United States held a significant geographic advantage in the production of water power. Rivers that moved rapidly due to a relatively steep incline produced more power compared to rivers which could more gradually float their way over long distances. The relatively short distance between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean meant the Northeast had the ideal conditions for the early industrialization of the area. As a result, the Northeast came to dominate the cloth industry domestically and became a major competitor to England and the cloth industry internationally. Both groups wanted to obtain raw materials, in this case cotton, at the lowest cost possible. During this period of time, the United States federal government was largely funded through tariffs, not through direct taxation. Tariffs are fees placed on imported or exported goods. Tariffs were presented as a way to fund the government while simultaneously protecting the developing American economy from potentially hostile powers within Europe. Although tariffs had originally been designed as a way to protect the developing domestic industry and fund the government, ultimately the difference in the rate of industrialization between the American North and the American South led to a split in tariff policy. The more heavily industrialized North wanted to use tariffs as a weapon to disadvantage their major rivals producing manufactured goods in Europe. The South, with its relatively lack of hydropowered industry, was more dependent on the import of manufactured goods and wanted the export of cotton and other raw materials internationally to buyers. By increasing tariffs, the North could force foreign players out of the cotton market, allowing them to secure cotton at artificially low prices at the expense of the South. This geographic and economic divide were at the center of the conflict between the industrial North and the agricultural South. The North, with its harsher growing environment, could not provide the cotton as the South could, and the South, with its relatively slow-moving rivers, could not participate in the early Industrial Revolution the way the North could. The capital, or money-intensive nature of industrialized work, also shaped how two societies would view slavery. Slaves were held by relatively few elite plantation owners in the South, amounting to about 4% of the population, and were concentrated in producing cotton, but also tobacco and rice. Because these crops required more manual labor and benefited less from improvements in harvesting tools than other crops, the amount of capital needed to invest in cotton harvesting was low. It amounted to providing a cheap burlap sack for the slaves to place the harvested cotton in. Slaves were employed as domestic servants and in other roles, but this tended to be a luxury afforded to the wealthy, rather than a profitable source of income. The more capital-intensive a system and industry became, the greater risk employing slaves became. Imagine trying to employ slave labor for workers operating with exceedingly complex mechanical looms. A single slave unhappy with their condition could subtly and anonymously send the entire operation into a literal grinding halt quite easily, simply by throwing a wrench into the mechanisms. It simply didn't make sense to take the risk to employ slaves around costly and complicated machinery compared to paying workers a voluntary wage. We might look back at the conditions in those factories now and disapprove of them. However, ultimately, they were filled with voluntary wage earners, frequently young women. Also, owning slaves was a lifelong commitment. If one was injured or maimed, the cost of that now less productive slave would be felt by the owner. Whereas the factory owners, whose workers could lose a finger or an arm in the gears, could be fired and tossed out on the street. As a result, hired laborers were often given tasks that were more likely to result in injury, even in the South. Notice how the morality of slavery has not come into play in the scenario yet. In order for the North to remain morally consistent with their opposition to slavery, they would have to have refused to purchase raw materials like cotton produced by slaves. However, this did not take place. In the end, no one profited more from slavery than the Northern industrialists, who turned the tariff-enforced, artificially cheap cotton produced by slaves into high-priced finished goods. Today, we might look at issues such as blood diamonds or conflict minerals and call out those involved in the process for purchasing them and call them out for their complicity. However, at this time, that did not happen. Ultimately, the story about the moral superiority of the North is a fairy tale, propaganda written by the victors of a terrible and bloody war. Only a small minority in the North were vocal abolitionists. The power struggle between the North and the South was born of their geographic differences, and the struggle of each group to attempt to protect their wealth and power from the other, not the supposed moral superiority of one group over the other. Thanks for listening to my video. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see others like it, you can check out my channel. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more content about interesting truths out there about history and life, and if you're wanting to expand your mind and challenge conventional narratives. This is Truth Toothpaste signing off.